So, good morning again. I think that you can receive me quite well now.
Yeah, we do.
Yes, excellent. So, I would like to welcome you all, dear students, colleagues, and translators, to this talk, in which we are very delighted to receive our distinguished guest speaker. So I would like to warmly welcome Dr. Philip Wilson. He is a friend of mine. We have met in Italy, in the UK, and he has a philosophy background also in addition to translation and literature. He's going to take us through a number of questions. What literature is one of them. Literary translation, and how to translate creative and dramatic prose and texts, and perhaps poetry as well, and whether poetry gets lost in translation. We are going perhaps also to speak about the status of the translated text against the original text. So we are going to see the specificities of a creative text. Philip Wilson is a lecturer in philosophy in the School of Politics, Philosophy, Language and Communication Studies at the University of East Anglia. He published books, so many books, such as the Luther Breviary, translated with John Gledhill, literary translation, redrawing the boundaries, Palgrave Macmillan, 2014, The Bright Rose, German verse, 1280, translated and edited in 2015. Translation after Wittgenstein, Routledge, 2016. The Routledge Handbook of Translation Studies and Philosophy. The Histories of Alexander Neville, translated and edited with Ingrid, Walton, and all. Simone Whale, Venice Saved, translated and edited with Silvia Panizza. His research interests include also mysticism, esotericism, and translation, Wittgenstein and the German Baroque. This is our guest speaker, ladies and gentlemen. So without further ado, I hand it over to Philip. You have the floor, Philip. Philip, I think you are muted.
Right, can you hear me? Yeah?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Thank you.
So shall I start? Yeah.
Yes.
I'd like to say thank you very much for this invitation. And this is one of the things I want to talk about, is how you go somewhere on a conference and you meet somebody, and this is really important. It's being in the right place at the right time. Though, funnily enough, often you don't know that at the time. It's very strange to be doing all this teaching now through computer, and here I am trying to sort of speak with my microphone off. But you get used to it, and I think we're going to have to find new ways of learning and new ways of translating, perhaps. Well, as Hammouda said, I teach at the University of East Anglia. I teach philosophy. I also translate. And I'm currently working, for example, on a translation of the poetry of Simone. Now, in philosophy, I don't know if you've spoken to many philosophers, but they can be very irritating people, because whenever you speak to a philosopher, you say something like, "What do you think about climate change?" And they always say, "Oh, it depends what you mean by climate change." And this can be very frustrating. And if you talk about translation, they always say to you, "Well, it depends what you mean by translation." And it's actually a very good question. what do we mean by translation? I think at the most basic level, a translation is when a text in one language replaces a text in another language. For example, I can't actually read Russian. I wish I could, but I can't. But I'm very fond of Russian literature. So every so often I will go to a bookshop and I will buy a novel in English, which actually replaces the novel in Russian. So, for example, I go into a bookshop and I say, have you got War and Peace? And they sell it to me, and I go home and I read War and Peace. Well, yeah. Am I reading Tolstoy? It's an interesting question, really. In some ways, I'm reading the words of the people who've translated Tolstoy. And yet, there's another sense in which I say to people, yes, I have read Tolstoy, because it replaces that book in my way of life. Now, Roman Jakobson has said that there are three types of translation. First of all, he said there was intralingual translation or rewording. That's when you're talking to somebody in English and somebody else comes in and they say, what did you say? And you sum it up very quickly. Secondly, he said there was interlingual translation or translation proper. That's when I take a poem, for example, in French, and I translate it into English, translation proper. Thirdly, he said there was intersemiotic translation or transmutation. I take a novel, for example, by Jane Austen, and I make a film about it. Well, obviously, with literary translation, we're looking at number two there, interlingual translation or translation proper. But, of course, interlingual translation is a very, very, very big field. And when you start looking at translation, you notice that people specialize in things. You've got people, for example, who specialize in legal translation, people who specialize in technical translation, people who specialize in interpreting. But I said I was going to talk about literary translation. So what is that? What would a philosopher say to that? Well, in translation studies, Theo Hermans has said that literary translation is usually understood as translation with respect to a certain kind of text that demands a certain type of strategy. All right, a certain type of text. So what are we talking about? Well, with literary translation, we're normally talking about novels, plays, poems, and a certain type of strategy. Well, I want to come on to that a little bit more, because the notion of literary translation is, in a way, you're going to have to translate in a certain way. It's not going to be good enough to actually just grab your dictionary and look words up. And Willis Barnstone has said that literary translation is very, very different from routine information transfer. Now, let's think about that. What is routine information transfer? Well, I suppose, for example, if I'm going to translate a menu, okay, I'm going to translate a menu from French into English. Well, to a certain extent, you could say that's fairly straightforward. If I'm going to translate a French novel, then, of course, things may get a bit more different. Now, in actual fact, the menu may not be that easy. There may be things on the menu that I have to ask about. I have to know a little bit about French cooking about. Adverts can be incredibly difficult to translate. But on the whole, let's stick with that. Literary translation is translating a certain type of text in a certain type of way. Now, of course, at this point, some people actually say literature can't be translated at all. I mean, there's that phrase, poetry is what is lost in translation. Interestingly, no one's quite sure who said that. Some people say it was Robert Frost, but I don't think he ever did. Poetry is what's lost in translation. Well, this is talked about a lot at the moment. You may have heard that Barbara Cassin published her Dictionary of Untranslatabilities a few years in French, which is now translated into English. So maybe that's the first thing to think about. Can literature be translated at all? Or is it actually untranslatable? Well, that's really too big a topic for today, but I will say two things about untranslatability. I'll say, first of all, that if literature is untranslatable, this is very odd, because you go into a bookshop, which of course we can't do now, but we go into a virtual bookshop and we find literary translations all over the place. All the great works of French literature are available in English, for example. And that's my second point, even books which are very, very difficult to translate. And I'm thinking, for example, here of James Joyce, an Irish writer who wrote Finnegan's Wake. Really difficult book, and yet it's been translated. In fact, Joyce himself translated it into Italian in parts. So I think we can, in a sense, not worry too much about the untranslatability debate, because the point is people do want literary translation. So how do we go about it? Well, I think the first thing to do is to realise that we can divide literary translation into 3 stages. First of all, we read for translation. Secondly, we write a target text. And thirdly, if we wish to, we can theorize the translation. Now, today I'm going to be looking at a sonnet by the French writer Gerard de Nerval, which I did send over. I don't know if you have that. If you don't have it, don't worry, because I'll be reading it as well.
Yeah,
and
the students got a copy of it. Thank you.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. So we've got this sonnet by Gerard de Nerval, and the first thing I do is I read it. But I read it for translation, and that's a very important point. To read for translation is not the same as reading. If I read for translation, the second I start reading, I even start to think, what would that be like in English? Why have they used that word? Should I keep that in French, or should I actually translate that word into English? Should I actually have the same typeface? When you read for translation, you're reading in a different way. And some people actually say that translation itself is a form of reading, that translation is a very, very detailed, a very close, a very patient form of reading. Somebody who's going to translate Arabic poetry into English, for example, is going to have to be a very good reader of Arabic poetry, and they're going to have to have read the Arabic poetry for translation. So I'm looking at my poem that I'm going to translate by Gerard de Nerval, and the first thing I actually notice is it's got a Spanish title, El Desdijado. Why? Well, that's odd, and that's odd. What am I going to do about it? Well, let's not worry too much about that. Let's just actually have a look at the French. And I'll read this to you in French. It goes, Je suis le ténébreux, le veuf, l'inconsolé, le prince d'Aquitaine à la tour abolie. Ma sœur l'étoile est morte, et mon lit constellé porte le soleil noir de la mélancolie. Now, what does make something literary? Now, that's a big subject, but it seems to me that something about literature is its language being used in new ways. The familiar is being made to feel strange. The author is using striking images. There's a very keen engagement with form. In other words, style. Now, this word style, I think we can think of style as being about choices. When I talk about style to undergraduates, they often get very worried and they say, I don't know what style is. I can't understand it. It's too hard. And I say to them, don't worry about style. Style is about choice. Let's imagine you're going to a wedding. The big question is, what are you going to wear? Are you going to wear a suit? If you're male, are you going to wear a tie, etc.? What are you going to actually wear? What are you going to choose to wear? And it happens the same with writing. If I write an email to somebody, a very close friend, I can write in a very informal way. If I was to write to the Vice-Chancellor of my university, I'll write in a very different way. And if I write a poem, I write differently again. Now, Jean Boase-Beier has argued that literary translation goes wrong when it doesn't actually address the style of the source text. Because literature is not like a piece of prose. It's not like a manual for a fridge. It's not like a piece of information. We've actually got to respond to the style. We've got to stop seeing literature as code. Now, a lot of people in the past have thought that language was a code. But no, I mean, philosophy will tell us that language is much more than a code. Code implies there's only ever one answer. If I were to read this poem to you, El Desdijado, Je suis le ténébreux, le veuf, l'inconsolé. If it were a code, there's only going to be one correct answer to how this poem is going to be read. But in actual fact, we know that if we read a poem to 50 different people, you get 50 different interpretations, 50 different ways of actually reading the poem, because literature is all about interpretation. Now, the first way of translating literature might then be a gloss, which is what I did for you. Now, to gloss a poem, or a piece of prose is a tool in translation. I do it because I'm English. I will do it by actually writing the English words underneath the French words. And this allows somebody with no understanding of French to actually see what's going on in the poem. And it's essential. If I want to actually write in translation studies, I can't assume everybody can read French. For example, if I was going to actually if I wanted to know about an Arabic poem, somebody's going to have to actually put the English words underneath for me. Otherwise, I'm just not going to have a clue. And in fact, for Arabic, I reckon for an English audience, I would probably transliterate it as well, because obviously I can't, again, read Arabic script. I wish I could, but I can't. So if we actually gloss the French, we get, I'll just do the first line, we get, Je suis le ténébreux, le veuf, l'inconsolé. I am the shadowy one, the widower, the unconsoled one. And we've got our gloss. Now, a gloss is very useful for somebody who can't speak the language. It shows what's going on in the French. But of course, once you start to do a gloss, you see some strange things start to happen. Jacobson has said, and this was on your sheet, he says, languages differ not in what they may say, but in what they must say. Now, I think that's a really, really important thing to say about translation and about language in general. Languages differ not in what they may say, but in what they must say. Now, it's actually really quite difficult to get your head around this. So let's think of French. French, for example, has got gender. I don't say melancholy, it's la mélancolie. Now, in English, I don't have gender. We have, I say melancholy. French has got to have gender. Again, French has got to put the adjective behind the noun. I know there are certain times you wouldn't do, but I talk about la tour abolie, well, you see, I would say the broken tower, but a French person says the tower broken. And the gloss is immediately showing why translation is difficult, because it's not a code. Languages work in different ways. You can say anything you want in French. You can say anything you want in Arabic. If you want to write a book about nuclear physics in Arabic, can you do it? Well, of course you can do it. But you will do it in a different way to the way it would be done if you're writing in English. And that's what makes translation difficult, because the gloss, I can't see the gloss ever replacing the poem. You know, somebody's not going to have it by their bedside to read at night. Somebody's not going to sit there on a train reading glosses. It's just not going to work. And why? Because a gloss is not a response to the style. And that's maybe what we have to do, is actually look at the style. And that's when we move on to stage 2 in literary translation. Stage 2 is when we write the target text. And I think this is the hard work. Gregory Rabassa was once translating the Colombian novelist Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And someone said to him, do you think your Spanish is good enough to translate Marquez? And Rabassa said, yes, of course my Spanish is good enough. I'm worried about whether my English is good enough. And I think that's the key thing. When you do literary translation, you're actually writing I'll be writing in English, because that's my mother tongue. Now, the point is my English going to be good enough for this? Am I actually going to write well enough? And my way in, of course, is by reading carefully, but now I've got to write carefully. So I had a few goes at translating this poem by Neville. And my first one, I thought, well, why not just translate into prose? And I've translated it like this, which is on your sheet. I am the man of shadows, the widower, the man of no consolation, the prince of Aquitaine with the fallen tower. My only star is dead, and my starry lute carries the black sun of melancholy. Well, that's a translation. I'm quite pleased with it. It's a literary translation. And you'll notice that, again, I'm writing in English. I'm not saying my lute starry. I'm not saying my sun black. I'm not saying the melancholy, I'm saying melancholy. I'm actually writing English, which of course is what we do. I noticed when I did the original gloss, I actually made a mistake because I wrote broken tower instead of tower broken. It's so easy to do because that's the way we write. So yes, maybe this is a literary translation, but of course, in some ways it fails to represent the French because, well, it's a piece of prose. Now, the French is poetry, so you can argue that the prose doesn't actually represent poetry. And when we start talking like this, what we're actually realizing is that literary translation is not a mathematical task. It's not a leap from dictionary to dictionary, but a reimagining, as Octavio Paz says. I love that. It's not a leap from dictionary to dictionary, but a reimagining. If I'm going to actually translate something, now of course I need a dictionary, but I've got to go a bit further. So maybe if I'm going to translate Nerval, maybe I should try to write as a poet. Maybe I should try and write. Robert Lowell said, you should try and write as if the poet were around today. So if you're translating an English poet into Arabic, you should pretend that English poet was walking down the streets of Tunis today and has somehow learnt Arabic. What would they say? Well, how about this for Nerval? I am the shadowed man, widowed and unconsoled, the prince of Aquitaine, with the tower that fell down. My only son is dead, and here my spangled lute carries melancholy, carries the blackest sun. Well, I've kept the 12 syllables, I've kept the rhymes, I've kept the images. Now, obviously, I haven't preserved the sound, because how could I? The original is in French, and I'm writing in English. So you could say that I haven't preserved that, but I don't see how I could. Now, I think when you translate, the main thing you do is you make decisions about what you're going to maintain, what you're going to imitate. Think about let's go back to that title, for example, El Desdicado, Spanish. What am I going to do with that title? Am I going to keep it in Spanish? Am I going to translate it into English? Well, I have published translation of this poem, and the final translation, which I gave you, is this one, which goes like this. My life has failed, and both my wives are dead. The garden wall fell down 2 months ago. They're cutting off the gas. I stay in bed, working out chords of songs I used to know. Well, you could call that I don't know what you call that. You could call it a relocation. You could call it a modernization. The French is written in Alexandrines. This isn't. This is written in iambic pentameter, because that's the way a lot of English poets write. And the images that Nerval uses are given new images. The Aquitaine tower that falls down is now replaced by a garden wall that falls down. Now, I think I can do this. Some people would immediately say that your translation is far too free. I think I can do it because Nerval is so well known. There are so many translations of Nerval. If somebody wants a conventional translation, they can go for it. But here I decided that I actually just wanted a translation that's going to actually work as a poem, that's going to be inspired, and that's going to, in a sense, be free. And I can do that because Nerval is a well-known author. Now, this introduces an idea that
Sorry, Philip, there is a background noise.
Yeah, I can hear that too.
You can hear that too. We hope that it can disappear soon.
Should I just... It seems to be okay. Are we okay? Cool.
Gone now, yes. It's gone now, yes. Thank you.
Great. Now, Rice and Vermeer, therefore, they talk about the skopos of a translation. Skopos, S-K-O-P-O-S. Skopos is a Greek word. It means purpose or function or target. Now, they say that the key thing about any translation is there's a reason why it's being translated. There are people for whom it is being translated. Maybe, for example, you're asked to translate a French novel that was translated 100 years ago, and that translation is out of date. So they say, could we have a new one, please? The skopos of a translation. Now, when you ask questions like that, you are starting to theorize. You're starting to actually do theory. And that brings me to my third of my 3 points. The third one is when we theorize the translation. Now, it's important to remember who engages in translation theory. Well, clearly, there are people like me, translation scholars, but there are also literary critics. There are also translators. Translators do a lot of theory. For example, when they write an introduction or when they write notes to a translation. Readers, of course, can do translation theory as well. For example, when readers think about the nature of the translation that they're reading, whenever they consider that the words they are reading are not those of Tolstoy, but those of the translator, whenever they realize that these books are translated, Lawrence Venuti has always said that one big problem with translators is their invisibility. A lot of people forget that books are translated. And a lot of publishers don't like to put the name of a translator on the front of a book, for example. They pretend the book never was translated. And that's what translation theory is all about, is actually saying, no, you are reading a translation. And the basic project here is something called Descriptive Translation Studies, or DTS. We describe the target text. Often we compare it to the source text. So, for example, if I want to describe a translation of Balzac, I read the English novel, but then I also look at the French novel and I describe and I compare. A theory, now again, people get very worked up about what this word theory is, but a theory is basically a description, okay? That's what a theory is. But of course, theories can go a little bit further, because what we can do, if that's a theory, we can thicken theory. It's a strange word, but we can thicken it. We can actually include more in that. We saw that with Skopos theory. And we can describe, for example, a translation. We say when it was translated, who translated it, from which language, but why? Why was it translated? Lawrence Venuti, again, he says when he describes texts, he always looks at them in terms of, are they domesticated or are they foreignized? Do they hide the fact that they're a translation? For example, if I was translating a novel which said that somebody was walking down the Rue Pascal, do I translate that as Pascal Road, Pascal Street, or do I keep it as Rue Pascal? Am I going to foreignize that by showing this is French, showing that this is written, that this is set in Paris, or am I actually going to domesticate it and try and make this English? Very interesting question. Now, again, we now need to say, can theory tell us how to translate? Students always ask me this, and the answer is, of course, no, it can't, because a theory is a description, and a description can't tell you how to translate, but it can help you how to translate. It can drive a translation. When Christiane Nord translated the New Testament into German, the first thing she did was she looked at the Skopos and she said, what is the function of this translation? Why am I going to do it? And that's going to drive the sort of choices that I make. And that's why I think we need lots and lots of theories as we translate. We don't need just one or two. We need lots and lots of theories. And my own work, I've actually looked at the work of the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein, for example, talks about the language game. He says the way we play with language. And he says, so let's imagine you were translating a novel. Now, a really good novel, you'll find that characters speak in different ways because we're all different. The English I speak is very, very different from the English that my daughter speaks, for example. We all speak different sorts of English. And we all speak different sorts of French, etc., because we all play different language games. And my language games even change. If I'm talking today in the lecture, I speak very differently from the way I would be talking if I was at a football match, for example. So we have different language games. Prayer is a language game, saying thank you is a language game, telling a joke is a language game. And I've actually been very interested in, if we recognize that, as a translator, we can then try to play the same language games in our translation that are being played in the source text. So again, if I notice that characters in a novel speak differently, and I'm now going to write in English, I'm going to try and make them speak differently in English as well, because otherwise I'm not really representing that novel. And at very least, the knowledge of theory is going to allow you to justify the decisions you make. So let's go back to that poem I was talking about, that translation, El Desdijado. I would leave it in Spanish, actually, because if Neville used it in Spanish, that's what I would do. But I think you could translate it into English. I don't think it would be a problem. It actually comes from a novel by Walter Scott, and it's the name taken by a knight. So I'm trying to show that I'm going to leave it in Spanish because I want to show that I am signalling a translation into English of a French poem with a Spanish title based on an English novel written by a Scottish novelist. Wow. And that's how complicated translation is. And that's when people say poetry is what's lost in translation. I don't agree. Poetry is translation. All the great poems of the world are in a network of translation. If you look at great English poems, so many of them have been translated from other languages, or they're based on translations from other languages. That's what poetry is. It's a constant coming this way and that way between languages. So I'll just finish by asking you this. What if you actually want to be a literary translator, if that's what you'd like to do? Well, if you do, I've got 6 pieces of advice for you. First of all, I would read as much as you can in the language from which you want to translate. And I would ask yourself, what makes this literary? What is this author doing here? Think of Wittgenstein. What language games is this person playing? So, for example, Neville. It seems to me that Neville is playing a language game. He's got the north versus the south. I mean, you're from, you're all from the Mediterranean. If you read that poem, you'll notice he's got Mediterranean imagery, but at the same time, he's got sort of Gothic northern imagery, and that's what he's doing. So, and I think that's the first thing about language. We need to actually work out what's going on. So we need to read. Secondly, you need to actually read as much translated literature as you can. And if you can, a really good thing to do is to read it by the side of the original book. So if if I read that a new book has been translated from German, and sometimes I will buy the German novel and the English novel, and I'll look at the two, and I'll think, oh, that's interesting. I wonder why they chose that. That seems to work to me. That seems great. Not so sure about that. Well, that's the way it goes. What choices have been made? Thirdly, there's a whole world of literary translation that you can get involved in. And I know we're in a very difficult time, but a lot of this is flourishing online. You can network. You can meet people online. You can join online forums. You can go to literary events online. You can actually try and get involved in the world of literary translation. That's my third piece of advice. My fourth one is to read translation theory. Now, some translators don't like translation theory. They say it's a waste of time. But I think it's inevitable. You immediately have a theory whenever you do anything. If you're actually going to get up and go out of the room you're in at the end of this lecture, you need to have a theory about how you're going to do it. You need to have a plan for doing it. That's very basic. We have to have theory. And therefore, theory is very, very important. I mean, imagine a musician who said, no, I'm not interested in theory at all. Well, I don't think they're going to get very far in the world of music. And, can you imagine a musician who said, no, I don't like listening to others' pieces of music? No. My fifth point, read what translators say about their work. If you buy a book in translation, it's got a translator's introduction. And these are very, very interesting because they say why they've actually translated the way they have done. What have they done with the titles of the, if somebody's got somebody's called, for example, Le Maréchal, how are they going to translate that into English, or are they going to leave it in French? What if some of the French is rather old-fashioned? What are they going to do with it? Are they going to write old-fashioned English? Well, if you read these books, you can find that out. And the final thing, which takes me right back to the beginning, to what Hammouda said at the beginning, to be a translator, you need to be in the right place at the right time with the right skills. I'm here today and very happy to be here because I happened to meet Hammouda on a conference in Italy a few years ago. We were at the right place at the right time. Now, in a sense, being at the right place at the right time is a bit of, okay, that's luck. That's fortuna. That's fortune. But the third thing is not luck. You can have the right skills. And if you've got the right skills and you're in the right place at the right time, then that opens doors for you in literary translation. And above all, literary translation is fun. It's something I find very, very enjoyable because it gives you the chance to be an author in your own right. And above all, if you like reading, it's the best thing you can do because it means it is the most careful sort of reading you can do. World literature flourishes in translation. If I'm going to read Arabic literature, I need good people who are going to translate that into English for me. World literature, it flourishes in translation. It always has done. Somebody like, I think of my own country, Shakespeare, for example. Shakespeare is so popular because he's had good translators who have taken his plays around the world Shakespeare's translated to every language, really, you can think of. That's probably not true. There are still languages he is being translated into, but I bet even today people are working on Shakespeare being translated into new languages. World literature flourishes in translation, and as a literary translator, you're part of that tradition, and that seems pretty good to me. And at which point I finish, and I'm going to move over to Hammouda now. I think he's going to moderate some questions for me, which I will try to answer, but I may not be able to. Who knows?
Who knows? Thank you very much, Philip, for this very insightful presentation in which you took us through a journey you started by discussing the debate on translatability and translatability of literature. And then you took us to the importance of reading. But perhaps I give the floor to the other participants to ask questions. I would like to start by asking one question about reading. Reading might seem very straightforward as a word, as a term, but it is polysemous in the sense that it may mean interpretation. You read by interpreting what you read, or you read out loud, means you pronounce it. So in this sense, do you mean both meanings of reading, or just one, the first one, interpretation and thorough reading of the original text? If you mean both, then you pronounce what you are reading out loud for what purpose? In the sense, you said that it is a patient form of reading. Are you here invoking your creative source, your creative mind, your talent by reading it out loud, a piece of literature, especially poetry here, I mean, so that you can impersonate the author of the original text and mimic something? Because if you mimic also, you are creative and producing another creative piece of writing. So this is my first question. I hope it is clear.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, actually. I think you're right. You see, one thing I think Wittgenstein shows us is that there is never one meaning for any one word. And he talks about a family resemblance. He said words all come in a family. And of course, that's what makes translation so difficult. And it's so interesting because, people often come up to me and they say, what's, what's French for round? Okay, that's an easy question, isn't it? What's French for round? No, that's an incredibly difficult question. In fact, I can't answer it. I don't know what French for round is. I have to say, could you give me the context? Because there must be at least 30 different ways of saying round in French in respect to English. And I think that's one thing translation theorists have been attacking lately, is this notion of equivalence. They're saying don't even think about equivalence, because unless you're very careful what you mean by it. So I think that's a very good point you make. And I think the other point is what you said about interpretation, because the famous essay by the German philosopher Schleiermacher, he says that we can either, if you've got a reader and you've got to translate, you've got the text. He said you can bring the text to the reader, or you can bring the reader to the text. But what he actually says as well is it's the translator's interpretation that you're bringing the reader to. Whenever you write a translation, you always write an interpretation, and that's why it's very. I mean, I didn't say this, but it's a very good idea sometimes to buy or to borrow two translations of the same novel. So if you've got a Balzac novel and it's been translated into Arabic twice, have a look at them both. You find that they're very different. They make lots and lots of different decisions. And of course, once you make one decision, loads of others. The other final thing I'd say about reading for translator, reading is something you can be trained in. I know it sounds, and of course, we all think, I can read, but that's why people do degrees in literature, because they get trained to read. You get trained how to read Arabic poetry, because I would imagine, I'll use English poetry because I know it better. English poetry has got various things going on in it, which you can be trained in reading, because English poetry tends to go da-dum, 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 da-dum. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Once we know that, we can actually start to see it, but we have to be trained in it. So I think that's one thing you can get better at reading, and that's what a lot of people who translate say. They say they get better readers as a result. I hope that answered your question.
You did. Thank you. Let's take a first round of questions from the floor. We have Wael Ben Ali, Sarah Ben Arfi, Duha Mabrouk, and Abir Alwi. Do you mind if we take the four of them all together in the first round? Thank you. Yeah. Wael, please.
Hello, Mr. Philip. It's a pleasure having you with us today.
Thank you.
Well, you know that each language has its own characteristics, tools, and resources. And what distinguishes one poet from another is the way he uses and manipulates the techniques available to create his work. And we know that there is many figures of speech concerning concerning poetries, such as assonance, alliteration, metonymy, onomatopoeia, and these techniques might not be available in other languages. So my question is, do you think that translating poetry from one language to another might poorly affect the aesthetic side of the poem and even the spirit of the text? And thank you.
Thank you. Sarah Ben Arfi.
Hello, Mr. Philip. Thank you so much for the insightful presentation. My question is the following. Do you think that a translated literary work can be better than the original text while remaining faithful to it? And thank you.
Thank you. Duha Mabrouk.
Good morning. My question is, how can you stop yourself from actually getting drifted by the multiplicity of meanings in a text, in a literary text? And when you are translating, do you opt for an emulation of the original text? If there's an extended metaphor, do you actually copy the same method, the same, the same pattern of dialectic relation in the text, or do you create your own? Thank you.
Thank you. Yusra Gharbi.
Hi, Sir Philip. Thank you for your presentation. I want to ask you about something. Do you think it's possible to translate a book that is translated, for example, from Russian to English into another language, or it has to be translated initially from Russian? I mean, the original text. My second question is, what is the finest translated piece of literature that you've read so far? Thank you.
Thank you. Philip, over to you to take these questions.
Well, I think that they're amazing questions, actually. And, in some ways, I'm going to say, first thing I'm going to say is that in some ways, to all three or four of you, in one sense, obviously, I don't know, but I'm going to have a go at where I'm going to come from on this. And the first one was about manipulating techniques and that figures of speech may not be available. And does this change the aesthetic? I mean, I think it clearly does. I think what we've got to look at is how poets have actually dealt with this. If you look at some of the greatest poems in English literature, they are translations from from foreign literature, for example, Chaucer, one of our great poets, did translate a lot from the French. And what people do is yes, I mean, a good example would be something like parallelism, where biblical poetry works through parallelism. If you look at the poetry of the Hebrew Bible, for example, we get this sort of, and this happened, and then that happened. Now, we can't do it quite in the same way, but what people do is they find ways, they create ways in the new language of doing it. And that has two things. First of all, it reconfigures poetry in the new language. And secondly, of course, it changes the language, because it's through literary translation that English has actually changed. And I think that's a great challenge, because it's always very easy for me to translate from, well, it's not easy, but it's easier for me to translate from, say, French to English, because those languages are relatively close. The real challenges, I think, are for people who translate, for example, I used to teach in Turkey. My Turkish is terrible now, so please don't speak to me in Turkish. But one thing I noticed there was how different English and Turkish are. These are very, very different. And I think to do this, you need to be very creative. But I think what you need to do is you need to be really good. Translate from Turkish to English, you need to be really good at reading Turkish and really good at writing English. The second question was about the notion that, now I've just written down, actually, could I just ask for a repeat of that question? That was, I've just got written down, it was a translated literary work. I'm not quite sure what I meant by that.
Is this Doha, I think, who asked the question?
The second?
Second.
No, I asked the second question.
Yes, Sarah.
It was about if his personal view, if he thinks that a translated literary work can be better than the original text while remaining faithful to it.
That's right. Right, that's a really good question. I mean, I can always be a philosopher now that says, oh, but it depends what we mean by better, doesn't it? Because what's better for one person isn't better for another person. Having said that, I think what we have to do is look at history and look at individual languages. And there are certainly people who think that some translations are actually better than originals. I mean, some poems have been translated. For example, Catullus translated some Greek poems into Latin, and some people have actually said, yeah, these translations are much better than the original ones. Now, whether
Sorry, Philip, if I may paraphrase the question,
yeah.
In other words, perhaps it is a question of status, status of original text or a translation versus original text. Do you think that a translation has to remain a translation, or it can be a second parallel in literature?
I think in a way it depends. I think status is very important, is very right. I mean, in a sense, it depends what you want to do with it. A translation, you see, this notion, you see, an interesting one. Just move back a second. What if you're trying to translate you've got a really bad poem in French, and it's really terrible, and you want to translate it? I mean, should you keep it bad, or should you actually make it better? Should you improve it? And that's really where you wanted to go in what's called the polysystem, the system. Where do you actually want to place it in the system? So I think it depends. I honestly think it depends on what you choose to do with it. I do think a lot of translated poetry and a lot of translated literature has been better than the original. A lot has been significantly worse as well, of course. We've got to remember that. And I think we've got to actually really ask ourselves what we mean by this word faithful as well, because, what does it actually mean by being faithful? Because I think one thing you immediately see when you look at a gloss is you can't be faithful to the language. You really can't, because in French you would say la tour abolie. I can't say the tower abolished in English. I just can't. Now, you could argue that if I therefore say the abolished tower, I'm not being faithful. But maybe I'm also, in this case, I'm being faithful to English. So the problem with fidelity is it always asks the question, fidelity to whom? I'm just looking at the time, so I'll just move on to the third question. This was about the multiplicity of texts and emulation. I'm so really sorry. Could you possibly repeat the question again?
Yeah, of course. I said, how can you stop yourself from being carried away by the multiplicity of meaning in a text? You said earlier that when you read the text, you find there's the 50 interpretations for 50 people. As a translator, I think you're going to dig into all of these. And can you stop yourself from emulating the same text? Like you said, I think you almost answered that question. So.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, it's a brilliant question, actually. And I think you even see it on the word, for example, because you'll be translating one word and you suddenly realize it's got two meanings. The Derrida, the philosopher, he was once translating Plato, and he was translating the word pharmakon. Now, he said that pharmakon is usually translated into French as remède, medicine, but he said pharmakon can also mean a poison. So what do you do? Because Socrates says, I'm going to give you a pharmakon, I'm going to give you a medicine and a poison. Once you choose, you've gone one way. Now, maybe there are ways around it. For example, in English, we could translate it as I'm going to give you a drug, because drugs are good, but drugs are also bad. You know, drugs are very good because they save lives, but drugs are also very bad because they can destroy lives as well. So we've got problems. I think you've got to ultimately you've got to go for. You can go what Nabokov did. Who had more notes than text. He would, in his translations, he would have every one word would have a page of notes. But then who can read that really? So I think all you can do is make your choice, but tell people why you've made it. Is really the idea. And the final question. I think there were two questions. I think if I'm rightly, the first was about relay translation. Can you? If you've got a Russian novel, does it have to come straight to English? It can be translated into English, but do we always have to translate from the Russian, or can we translate from the translation? That's what I think it was. I mean, we call that relay translation. I think people say, most people I know say it's not ideal, but it's better than no translation at all. If you look at India, for example, the vast majority of translations into Indian languages are made from English. So if there's a new Arabic novel comes out and it's translated into English, Indian translators will work from the English because that's all they've got. Because one of the big problems in literary translation is skill sets. There are a lot of people around. For example, in England, there are a lot of people around who can translate French and English, French into English. Far fewer people who can translate Arabic into English. And then if you come to a language like Bengali, actually there'll be some there, but Mongolian, for example, hardly anybody can do it. And what about if you want to translate Arabic into Japanese? Well, it's getting very difficult. So I think relay translation is possibly the best we can do at the time. And talking about the finest translation, that's an interesting question. The one that they always say on your handout, I put an essay by somebody called Behrman, Berman, and Behrman says that the best translation that have been done is a German translation by a German poet called Hölderlin, and I would encourage you to investigate that, because it is. I mean, in no way is that a faithful translation, but in every way it is an astonishing translation. And maybe that's where we've got to be careful about the better, because better is going to be better for one or another. Is Hölderlin better than Sophocles? Well, I don't know. Let's just say they're both good in a way. Okay? Right. And Hammouda, are there any more?
I think time is almost up, but do you mind if we take a couple of questions, 5 minutes maximum? Yes, please. Thank you. So, Mohammed Salah, Taqwa Jandubi.
Greetings. Well, my question is as follows. You mentioned earlier that translation, in a sense, is a way of reading, and that interpretation differs as the reader differs. Is there any guidelines that will help the translator to grasp different sets of interpretations? Since we talked about glossary, musicality, and etc., and somehow we turn the blind eye to the critics written about that specific poem or novel. And My next question is based from an issue that I've faced while translating. Let's say the writer referred to a character from a fable or other short story, which doesn't have its equivalent in the target language and culture or literature. In such case, what is the best strategy to follow? Should we rather focus on conveying the meaning as much as possible, or to focus on drawing the same impact or symbolic image? For instance, when we talk about a reference made to Little Red Riding Hood, should we focus on transferring the story of the young girl and the bad wolf? Or should we focus on conveying the symbolic image of the naivety of the little girl without conserving her story? Thank you.
Thank you. Taqwa?
So my question is as the following. Could different translations
I think we lost you, Taqwa. Can you say it again, please?
So, could different translations of the same piece of work be affected by the culture or the era of the translation itself? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. If I may add one element to this question, Philip, we have in Arabic, we have a problem translating into Arabic and from Arabic because we have old-fashioned Arabic, classical Arabic, which we can still have access to, we can understand, and we can use to some extent. If we are, for example, translating something written in the English culture, let's say 5 or 6 centuries ago. So here, the translator is facing two choices: to opt for an old-fashioned version of the language to reflect that reality with specific elements, cultural elements, or references, or to adopt a new version of that language, which is still a translation in a translation, translating some old context with new language, new version of the language.
Yeah. Okay. Right, I'll go back to the first question. I think there are two questions there. You talk about ways of reading and interpretation, and this is clearly all very difficult. Are there any guidelines for the translators? I think there are basically if you see, some people think all of meaning is in the reader. They think everything is interpretation, and other people you think that everything is in the text. They say everything is in the text. I think what today people would say in translation is it's kind of in the middle. So I think the guidelines for the translator is that your interpretation must be to some extent based on facts, on things that you can point out. I mean, so somebody was talking about assonance or alliteration, for example. Now, it may be you're writing in a language which doesn't have assonance or alliteration, but you could be doing something, and somebody said, "Why are you doing that?" You're saying, "Well, I am responding to the assonance and the alliteration in the text." So I think we can actually look out for the formal features, and I would agree. We can look at the literary criticism as well for guidelines on that, and we can actually be guided by the ways of reading of people who've gone before us. When you talk about translating, for example, something like Little Red Riding Hood to culture that doesn't have it, in some ways, of course, this is. Obviously, I don't think there's any one right answer. I think this is when translation is very, very exciting, because you are pioneering something. You see this a lot. I think you've been having some lectures on Bible, on Quran translation, but you see this as a lot in the way that sacred literature is translated, for example, because if you're translating the Bible, if you're translating the New Testament, for example, for the people who live at the North Pole. Well, obviously, it's a very different weather system, isn't it? So a lot of the trees that you have in the Hebrew scriptures or the New Testament or the Quran, palm trees, for example, you're just not going to have. So what are you going to do? And I think the answer is, in one way, there are some things you can do that are wrong, that are definitely wrong. So, for example, Little Red Riding Hood, to me, has got various universals in it. And if you were to change those universals, then you, as a translator, to me, you're actually doing something that you shouldn't be doing. So, for example, if you have the wolf surviving at the end, well, no, because the point of that story is that that particular figure doesn't make it through the story. But so I think I'd like to quote something Wittgenstein said. He's answering a question. The question is, what shall I do? And the answer is, do anything you want, as long as you keep your eye on the facts. And if you do keep your eye on the facts, then there'll be some things that you will not do. And I think that's the answer. And the final thing about culture, again, clearly this is absolutely essential these days. And people look at this an awful lot about the way, again, if I think, for example, about the translations that have gone of the Bible, these have been affected very much by the cultures. You will see different words being chosen. I mean, for example, take the Greek word ecclesia, which means, I would tend to translate it as church, but that's because that's normally how you translate it. But if you, for example, look at the King James Bible, there's a big debate going about, do we translate it as church or do we translate it as congregation? Now, church has got a kind of Catholic ring to it. Congregation has got a kind of Protestant ring to it. So at the time, a lot of people, the King James Bible was trying to move away from Protestantism, and therefore went went back to the translation of church. So, and in terms of when you're looking at how you translate, again, I don't think there's ever really a right or a wrong way to. Well, I don't think there's ever one right way to translate. I think what you have to be able to do in literary translation is justify why you've done it. So if you take, for example, a translation of Arabic, for example, it's in classical Arabic. How am I going to translate that into English? Well, it's possible I might want to translate that into Middle English, because you might say that's a very, or Shakespearean English, but it'd be unusual. I don't think you get many readers if you did that. And I think, I hate to say it, but if you're having literary translation, the main thing you need to do is earn some money by it, okay? That's very important. You've got to make your living. And you'll only do that if you actually produce translations that people actually want to read. You also will find, if you do literary translations, that a lot of the time you don't, oddly enough, get as much choice as we would like you to, because you're going to translate a novel by Albert Camus into English, and the publisher says, we want it done like this. And you say, well, I was going to do it like that, and say, no, you're not. You're going to do it like this. So we have to remember as well that translation is working within constraints, okay? We work within constraints. But within those constraints, you have great freedom. And as somebody was saying, we don't have, you may be translating to a language which doesn't use alliteration. That's an awful constraint. But when you look at poets, they find amazing ways around it. That's what they always do. Okay?
Yes, thank you, sir.
Thank you. Time is up. So I am really very grateful to you, Philip, for accepting our invitation. Thank you for...
Excuse me, sir.
Yes?
Sir, I have one last question.
Do you mind if we take this one, Philip?
Fine.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Mr. Philip. Well, do you consider John Milton's Paradise Lost as a creative translation of the Bible, or is it original text, or it falls within the notion of what Roland Barthes and Julia Kristeva called intertextuality? And thank you.
Right, that's a really interesting question. I must say, actually, one thing I do want to say is the questions have been really, really good. They've really made me think, because here I am sitting here in England, I'm thinking, oh my God, what am I going to say to this? And that's really good. That's what questions should do. Yeah, I mean, I think John Milton is personally, I think John Milton is a very intertextual work. I would use there's a word which people are using a lot these days in translation. That's the word blend. I think Milton is both an original work and a highly derivative work, because it relies very much on the King James Bible. If you look, there are parts of it which he's almost taken word for word from the King James Bible. But I think people like Christopher are very good, because we need to rethink what originality is, because originality isn't doing something that nobody has ever done before. That's just really not possible these days. It possibly used to be. But originality, I think, is when you do something in your own way. Okay? So I think Milton is an incredibly original poet. And one of the reasons he is original is because he's intertextual. It's what he does with the King James Bible that matters.
Philip.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Philip, thank you very, very much for speaking to the Encounters at the Shores of Translation. We are grateful for the time and effort you took to share your thoughts, experience, your creativity with literary texts and literary translation. In fact, you gave us more than just an overview of this field, literary translation. Speaking on behalf of everyone here, I would like to express appreciation for your inspiring and enjoyable presentation. It reflected the person I know for so many years now, with that multidisciplinary background, philosophy, translation, literature, and so on. It also reflected the inspiring person. Thank you very much again. And this is not the end of the encounters. We still have many more encounters to come. One of them is within or in 2 hours. And we will be also delighted to receive another guest speaker, who is Jean-Marie Leray. He's a translator, and he will be speaking on de l'évolution du métier, de la traduction et de la nécessité de s'adapter. Thank you very much. And if you would like to take the floor just to make some concluding remarks.
Well, thank you. I mean, in fact, thank you very, very much, Hammouda, for inviting me. I really appreciated it, and it's been lovely to speak to you all. And who knows? Maybe we will meet again. I think. Who
knows?
I think this is one of the. I mean, well, obviously the world is so difficult, and you put the news on, and usually you hear terrible stories of terrible things everywhere. And yet, translation is a way that we can actually. It is a way, really, of bringing people together, and that's why it's such a wonderful thing. That's why it's such an important thing. So I'd like to wish you all good luck in your studies, and I hope we meet again.
Thank you very much. With this note, we end this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Right.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Philip.